That jet can take off if you want it to, Daniel Brooks said quietly, never taking his eyes off the polished engine nacelle. But I am not sure it will ever land. The words drifted across the executive hangar like a cold wind, and for a brief second, every conversation stopped. The massive Gulfstream sat beneath brilliant white maintenance lights at the private aviation terminal outside Savannah, Georgia, its silver fuselage reflecting rows of expensive luxury cars and the tailored suits of executives preparing for the most important business flight of the year. Mechanics rolled equipment across the spotless concrete floor while technicians studied glowing diagnostic tablets, each of them convinced the aircraft had already passed every required inspection. Daniel stood apart from them all wearing a faded mechanic's jacket stained with years of honest work, a heavy toolbox resting beside his boots. His broad shoulders and calm expression attracted little attention until he spoke. To everyone else, he looked like another contract mechanic hired for routine maintenance. No one noticed the quiet confidence that came from thousands of hours spent listening to machines instead of people. Across the hangar, Madison Reed stepped out of a black luxury SUV surrounded by assistants, attorneys, and senior executives from Reed Meridian Aerospace. At 32, she carried herself with effortless authority, her chestnut hair perfectly styled, every decision measured, every movement practiced. Investors were already waiting in New York for a merger worth billions of dollars, and every minute of delay carried a staggering financial cost. She barely glanced at Daniel before turning toward the chief maintenance supervisor. "Is there a problem with my aircraft?" she asked. Frank Dalton forced a polite smile. "No, ma'am. Just an overly cautious mechanic." A few technicians exchanged amused looks. Someone chuckled quietly. Daniel remained still. "I heard something that should not exist," he replied. Frank folded his arms. "The diagnostics are clean. Machines speak before computers do." Another mechanic laughed. "You cannot hear software." Daniel looked back at the engine. "No, but I can hear metal." Madison finally studied him for more than a passing second. She saw grease on his hands, worn work boots, and a toolbox older than many of the employees standing nearby. She also noticed something unexpected. He was not nervous. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was simply waiting. "How long have you been working on private aircraft?" she asked. "Long enough to know when one is asking for help." Frank sighed impatiently. "With respect, Ms. Reed, this is exactly why contract mechanics should stay in their lane. The inspection is complete." Daniel slowly reached toward the polished engine cowling and rested 2 fingers against the cool aluminum surface. He closed his eyes for barely 3 seconds. The vibration was almost impossible to detect, softer than a heartbeat, buried beneath the steady hum of electrical systems. Yet something inside the engine answered with an uneven rhythm that did not belong. He stepped back. "There is a replacement bolt inside the accessory gearbox." Frank shook his head immediately. "Impossible," Daniel continued calmly. "It is newer than the surrounding hardware. It carries the wrong vibration pattern." One of the younger engineers frowned and quietly checked the maintenance history. According to every digital record, no replacement had ever been installed. Madison crossed her arms. Uncertainty replacing irritation for the first time. "You are asking me to delay a flight worth billions of dollars because you think you heard one bolt." Daniel met her eyes without raising his voice. "No, Ms. Reed. I am asking you to delay it because someone wanted you to believe there was only one." The silence that followed felt heavier than the aircraft itself. Madison Reed looked from Daniel to Frank Dalton, then back toward the waiting aircraft, as every passing second carried another reminder that board members and investors were expecting her in New York before noon. "You said someone wanted me to believe there was only one," she said calmly. "You have exactly 1 hour to explain what that means." Frank immediately objected. "Ms. Reed, we are wasting valuable time. Every certified inspection has already been completed." Daniel lifted his toolbox without responding to the criticism. "Then another hour will not change anything if you are correct." Madison gave a single nod. 1 hour. The hangar came alive again as technicians stepped aside, some shaking their heads while others watched with growing curiosity. Instead of walking toward the diagnostic computers, Daniel approached the aircraft with nothing more than a flashlight, a small inspection mirror, and a pair of thin work gloves. Several engineers exchanged skeptical smiles. One whispered that nobody serviced a multi-million-dollar business jet like it was an old pickup truck. Daniel ignored every comment. He crouched beneath the left engine and rested one hand against the lower access panel. He closed his eyes again, listening instead of looking. The faint vibration returned in uneven intervals, almost disappearing before quietly returning again. It was subtle enough to fool sensors programmed to measure averages instead of brief inconsistencies. Daniel removed several fasteners and carefully opened the maintenance panel. The interior looked spotless, exactly as it should after a recent inspection. He slowly examined every cable, bracket, and hydraulic line before stopping at a single mounting bolt. "There," he said softly. Frank stepped closer with visible impatience. "That bolt came from the factory." Daniel gently ran his finger across its surface. "No, it was manufactured 6 months ago." An engineer frowned. "How could you possibly know that without reading the part number?" Daniel pointed toward a nearly invisible machining pattern around the bolt head. "The supplier changed their finishing process this year. The older bolts have a different texture." Curious now, the younger engineer wiped away a thin layer of protective lubricant and finally located the microscopic production code. His expression changed immediately. "He is right." A quiet murmur spread through the hangar. Frank crossed his arms tighter but refused to surrender. "Replacing one bolt does not ground an aircraft." Daniel nodded. "Correct. But replacing one bolt without recording it means someone wanted nobody to ask why." He continued, inspecting the surrounding components until another detail caught his attention. He leaned closer to a hydraulic fitting and paused. "Do you smell that?" One technician shrugged. Another inhaled carefully before shaking his head. Daniel reached for a clean cloth and lightly touched the fitting. Hydraulic fluid should not carry the scent of industrial solvent. Madison stepped forward for the first time, curiosity replacing frustration. "What does that tell you?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Someone cleaned this area very recently, but not to remove dirt. They cleaned away fingerprints and residue." The room grew noticeably quieter. Even Frank stopped interrupting. Daniel followed a narrow wiring bundle disappearing deeper into the aircraft and noticed a sensor cable secured with a brand new fastener that did not match the surrounding hardware. Everything appeared professional at first glance, yet every tiny inconsistency pointed toward deliberate human intervention instead of ordinary maintenance. Just then Daniel's phone vibrated inside his jacket. He smiled as he answered. "Hey, sweetheart." Grace's cheerful voice filled the silence. "Dad, are you still coming to my school concert tonight?" Daniel looked briefly toward the aircraft before smiling again. "I promised you I would try my best, and I always keep my promises." Madison quietly watched the brief conversation. For the first time, she saw not a stubborn mechanic challenging her authority, but a father balancing responsibility with quiet determination. After ending the call, Daniel returned to the aircraft and shined his flashlight through a narrow service opening. Deep inside the compartment, beyond the standard wiring harness, he noticed a faint smear of fresh grease beside an access hatch that only authorized senior personnel were permitted to open. He slowly lowered the flashlight and looked directly at Madison. "Whatever someone was hiding," he said quietly, "it is not inside the engine. It is behind that panel." Daniel did not touch the hidden access hatch immediately. Instead, he studied the narrow trail of fresh grease beside the latch, then quietly looked around the hangar. "If someone opened this compartment," he said, "they expected nobody to notice they had been here." Frank Dalton forced a laugh. "Every mechanic leaves fingerprints somewhere." Daniel slowly shook his head. "Experienced mechanics do. Professionals cleaning up after themselves do not." The words settled over the room with uncomfortable weight. Madison stepped closer until she stood only a few feet away. "Open it," she said. Daniel nodded once and carefully removed the security fasteners one at a time. Every movement was deliberate, almost patient enough to make the growing silence louder than the electric lights humming overhead. When the panel finally swung open, the compartment looked ordinary at first glance. Bundles of factory wiring stretched neatly across the interior. Avionics modules sat exactly where they belonged, and every inspection seal appeared untouched. Frank folded his arms with quiet satisfaction. "There is nothing there." Daniel reached inside anyway. His fingertips paused behind a structural support where no standard inspection required access. "Someone added weight here," he murmured. "Not much." About 2 pounds. One of the younger engineers frowned. There is no listed equipment in that location. Daniel carefully slid out a small rectangular device wrapped in black composite material. It carried no manufacturer logo, no maintenance label, and no serial number visible from the outside. The room became perfectly still. Madison stared at the object. What is it? Daniel turned it over without disconnecting any wires. It is pretending to be something it is not. Frank immediately stepped forward. Do not touch company equipment. Daniel calmly looked at him. Then tell us what company installed it. Frank hesitated for barely a second before answering. It is probably an upgraded security module. Daniel smiled for the first time that morning, although there was no humor in it. Security modules are documented. They also do not draw power from an emergency flight circuit. An engineer quickly opened the aircraft wiring schematic on his tablet. His eyes widened. He is right. This connection is not on the factory diagram. Madison slowly lowered the tablet from his hands and studied the unfamiliar device herself. Can you remove it? Daniel shook his head. Not yet. Whoever installed this expected someone to disconnect it. I would rather know what it is hiding before I know how it works. He followed the wiring deeper into the compartment until it disappeared beneath another protective panel. The cable bypassed several standard connectors before joining the aircraft data network through an unauthorized path. Daniel looked back toward Madison. This is not stealing electricity. It is listening. The words immediately changed the atmosphere inside the hangar. Executives exchanged uneasy glances while attorneys quietly stepped away from their phone calls. Madison's expression hardened. Listening to what? Daniel answered carefully. Flight plans, passenger information, internal communications, possibly everything transmitted through this aircraft. Frank quickly interrupted. That is speculation. Daniel remained composed. Then let us test it. He connected a portable analyzer from his old toolbox, a scratched instrument that looked far older than the sophisticated computers surrounding it. Within seconds, a tiny signal appeared on the display, repeating every few moments toward an unknown destination. One engineer whispered, "It is transmitting." Nobody laughed anymore. Madison stared silently at the blinking signal before asking the question no one else wanted to voice. Who would want access to my aircraft? Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he noticed something almost invisible engraved beneath a corner bracket supporting the hidden device. It was not a company logo or a part number. It was a tiny compass rose with 3 engraved stars surrounding its center. His breathing slowed for the first time since opening the compartment. Very gently, he brushed dust away from the symbol with the edge of his glove, then quietly closed the protective panel without mentioning what he had seen. The emblem was strangely familiar. He had seen it only once before, many years earlier, inside a secure engineering laboratory where almost no visitors were ever allowed. As the transmission indicator continued, blinking across the analyzer screen, Daniel realized the hidden device was only the beginning. Whatever secret someone had buried inside Madison Reed's aircraft had been carefully protected for years, and the small forgotten emblem suggested the truth reached far deeper than anyone inside the hangar could possibly imagine. Madison Reed slowly folded her arms as the tiny transmission indicator continued blinking across Daniel's portable analyzer. The executives standing behind her no longer looked impatient. They looked uncertain. The confidence that had filled the hangar less than an hour earlier had quietly disappeared. Frank Dalton cleared his throat. There is still no proof this device is dangerous. It could simply be collecting maintenance information. Daniel looked at the hidden wiring one more time before answering. Maintenance systems report to technicians. This one reports somewhere else. He carefully traced the unauthorized cable farther into the aircraft until it disappeared beneath the floor structure leading toward the fuel management electronics. One engineer frowned as he compared the routing against the official blueprint. That cable should never pass through this section. Daniel nodded. Because it was never designed to. Madison stepped closer. Can you show us exactly what it is connected to? Daniel removed another inspection cover with deliberate patience. Behind it rested a small interface board attached between the aircraft data network and the digital fuel management controller. The room became silent again. Daniel pointed toward the board without touching it. Someone built a bridge between two systems that should never communicate directly. Frank immediately protested. That does not prove sabotage. Daniel remained calm. No, It proves unauthorized control. A senior avionics engineer adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. Within seconds, his expression changed. If this interface sends false sensor information, the cockpit could receive inaccurate fuel calculations. Another engineer quietly added, the pilots would trust the instruments because every backup system would agree with the same false data. Madison slowly looked from the hidden hardware to Daniel. Would that cause an accident? Daniel answered carefully. Not immediately. It would create a situation that appears to be an ordinary technical failure. That is what makes it so dangerous. The hangar fell into complete silence as everyone understood the difference. This was not a broken aircraft. It was an aircraft designed to hide the truth. Frank suddenly pointed toward Daniel. How would you even know something this specific unless you installed it yourself? Several security officers instinctively looked toward Daniel. He did not react. He simply stepped away from the aircraft and held up his grease-stained gloves. Because whoever built this understood aviation safety extremely well. They wanted investigators to blame the machine instead of the person. Madison studied his face. There was no fear in his expression, only disappointment. She raised one hand toward the security officers. Nobody is detaining anyone until we have facts. Daniel quietly removed the hidden interface board and placed it inside a protective evidence bag from his toolbox. As he turned it over beneath the light, something caught his attention. Etched into one corner was the same tiny compass rose surrounded by 3 stars. This time another marking appeared beneath it. 3 simple letters. W. R. Madison immediately noticed his expression. What is it? Daniel hesitated for the first time all morning. These initials. Madison looked closely. Her breathing slowed. Walter Reed. The name belonged to her late father, the founder of the company, and one of the most respected aerospace engineers in the country. Frank immediately seized the opportunity. There. That proves this equipment was authorized by the founder himself. Several executives nodded with visible relief. Daniel did not. He gently ran his thumb across the engraved initials until a thin layer of residue lifted away. Beneath the letters, another faint engraving appeared, almost invisible after years inside the compartment. It read, Revision 4. Daniel quietly smiled, but only for a moment. Your father never labeled prototype hardware this way. Madison looked surprised. How could you possibly know that? Daniel carefully sealed the evidence bag before answering. Because Walter Reed believed every revision deserved a complete date and signature. He never used numbers by themselves. Frank immediately dismissed the observation as meaningless, but Madison continued staring at Daniel instead of the device. She realized he had not guessed. He had remembered. Before she could ask another question, one of the company attorneys hurried into the hangar carrying an old digital maintenance archive retrieved from corporate storage. We found something unusual, he announced. There is no record that this compartment has been opened in over 12 years. Daniel quietly looked back toward the aircraft. Then someone erased more than fingerprints. The words from the company attorney lingered in the quiet hangar like a warning no one wanted to acknowledge. There is no record that this compartment has been opened in over 12 years. Madison Reed slowly accepted the digital archive and scrolled through the maintenance history herself. Every inspection, every software update, every scheduled service had been carefully documented. Yet the compartment where the hidden device had been discovered appeared untouched since shortly before her father passed away. Someone erased the history, she whispered. Daniel Brooks gently shook his head. No, someone rewrote it. The distinction mattered. Erasing records created empty spaces. Rewriting them created believable lies. Frank Dalton stepped forward with growing frustration. This is turning into conspiracy theory. We have a merger waiting. We have investors waiting. We cannot stop an entire company because of one undocumented component. Daniel calmly looked at him. You are not afraid of delaying a meeting. Frank frowned. What does that mean? Daniel answered quietly. You are afraid of what happens if this aircraft never leaves this hangar. Nobody spoke. Madison slowly shifted her attention toward Frank, noticing for the first time that his confidence had become unusually forced. Before she could ask another question, Daniel carefully connected the evidence bag to his portable analyzer without removing the device from its protective seal. Tiny streams of encrypted data immediately appeared across the aging display. The younger engineers watched with surprise. One of them quietly admitted that he had never seen equipment that old processed modern encrypted aviation signals. Daniel smiled faintly. Good tools grow old. Good engineering does not. Madison found herself studying the man instead of the machine. Every answer he gave sounded less like theory and more like memory. He never searched for information. He recognized it. The analyzer suddenly produced a soft notification tone. A hidden storage partition had been detected inside the mysterious module. Can you open it? Madison asked. Daniel nodded slowly. Eventually, whoever built this wanted only one person to read it. Frank immediately interrupted. Destroy it before it compromises company security. Daniel looked at him with calm curiosity. Interesting. Frank stiffened. What is interesting? Daniel answered without raising his voice. You already know there is something inside. The room fell silent again. Frank quickly corrected himself, saying he was only protecting confidential company property, but the explanation sounded weaker than before. Daniel ignored the excuse and continued examining the encrypted directory. Hundreds of maintenance logs appeared to be ordinary system files until one folder refused to display a standard name. Instead, it showed only a single date. October 14th. Madison quietly repeated the date under her breath. That was my father's last flight. Daniel did not answer immediately. He carefully examined the digital signature protecting the folder. Then his expression changed ever so slightly. It was the same expression Madison had seen when he recognized the tiny compass emblem hidden inside the aircraft. You have seen this before, she said. Daniel remained silent for several seconds. A long time ago. Where? She asked. He looked at the old encryption pattern one last time before speaking. Inside a secure engineering laboratory that no longer officially exists. Madison frowned. My father never told me about such a place. Daniel quietly replied, most people who worked there were never supposed to discuss it. Before anyone could ask another question, the analyzer unlocked a tiny audio directory. There was only one recording. The file name contained no description. Only two initials. WR. Every executive instinctively leaned closer. Madison's hand trembled slightly as she reached toward the playback button, but Daniel gently stopped her. Not here. She looked confused. Why? Daniel glanced around the crowded hangar filled with executives, technicians, attorneys, security officers, and employees who had been quietly gathering throughout the morning. Because the person who hid this message expected someone else to hear it too. Madison slowly lowered her hand. Daniel slipped the analyzer back into his toolbox and closed the lid with deliberate care. As the metal clasps clicked into place, his eyes briefly settled on a worn leather tag attached to the handle, nearly faded by years of use. Stamped into the old leather was the same tiny compass rose surrounded by 3 stars. He covered it with his hand before anyone else noticed, and for the first time since entering the hangar, he quietly wondered whether he had not simply discovered someone else's secret. He wondered whether, years before he chose the quiet life of a single father, that forgotten secret had once belonged to him. Madison Reed looked around the executive conference room overlooking the private hangar after quietly asking everyone except her legal counsel, the chief avionics engineer, Daniel Brooks, and Frank Dalton to leave. The glass walls reflected the parked aircraft outside, while the mysterious device rested in the center of the polished conference table. Nobody spoke until the heavy door closed. Madison finally broke the silence. Play the recording. Daniel slowly placed the analyzer beside the sealed evidence bag, but did not press the button. Before we do that, he said, there is something you deserve to know. Frank immediately interrupted. There is nothing else to discuss until our legal department verifies chain of custody. Daniel calmly looked toward him. That can wait another minute. Then he turned back to Madison. Years ago, before I became a contract mechanic, I worked as an aviation systems engineer. Madison studied him carefully. For whom? Daniel answered without hesitation. For your father. The room became completely still. Even the steady hum of the air conditioning suddenly seemed louder. Frank stared across the table in disbelief. That is impossible. Daniel reached into his worn leather toolbox and removed an old identification badge whose edges had faded with time. The photograph showed a younger version of him, but the name beneath it was unmistakable. Daniel Brooks, Senior Flight Systems Engineer. Reed Meridian Advanced Research Division. Madison slowly accepted the badge with both hands. I have never heard of this division. Daniel gave a quiet nod. Most employees never did. It handled experimental aviation safety projects. Your father believed some technologies were too important to be influenced by quarterly profits. Madison looked back at the faded badge before quietly asking, "Why did you leave?" Daniel remained silent for several seconds. "Because my wife became seriously ill." His voice never changed, but every word carried years of quiet acceptance. "I could not travel constantly while raising our daughter and caring for her. After she passed away, my daughter needed a father more than the industry needed another engineer." Nobody interrupted him. There was no anger in his voice and no desire for sympathy. Only truth. Madison lowered her eyes. "My father never mentioned your name." Daniel smiled gently. He respected privacy. He believed family was never a weakness. Frank suddenly leaned forward. "Convenient story. Anyone could invent an old employee badge." Daniel simply placed another item on the table. It was a small brass calibration tool worn smooth from years of use. Engraved across one side were the same compass rose and 3 stars that had appeared inside the aircraft. The chief avionics engineer immediately picked it up. His expression changed. These tools were custom manufactured only for the Advanced Research Division. They were never sold commercially. Frank's confidence began to fade. Madison quietly looked from the tool to the faded leather tag still attached to Daniel's toolbox. "That symbol," she whispered. "It is on your toolbox too." Daniel nodded. "Walter gave it to every engineer who completed the original safety program. He said the compass reminded us that technology should always point people home." The words settled over the room with unexpected emotion. Madison slowly closed her eyes. She remembered seeing the same compass symbol as a child hanging inside her father's study, although she had never known what it represented. Daniel finally pressed the playback button. Static filled the speaker for several seconds before the familiar voice of Walter Reed emerged, older but unmistakably calm. "If you are hearing this recording, then someone has discovered what I could not protect alone." Everyone listened without moving. Walter continued, "Madison, if you are with Daniel Brooks, trust his judgment before you trust my company." Madison looked up in stunned silence. Walter's voice continued, "He will probably insist he is only a mechanic now. Do not believe him. Daniel always repairs more than machines. He repairs the truth." The recording suddenly stopped. No explanation followed. No names were given. Only silence remained. Daniel quietly looked at the frozen playback screen before speaking almost to himself. That was never the complete message. Then he noticed something everyone else had missed. At the bottom of the analyzer display, a tiny indicator had appeared after the recording ended. It read, "Segment 1 complete. Remaining files, 3. Daniel Brooks kept his eyes on the analyzer for several long seconds as the words "Segment 1 complete" remained frozen on the screen. Nobody in the conference room reached for the device. Nobody interrupted the silence Walter Reed had left behind. Madison Reed slowly exhaled and looked toward Daniel. 3 more recordings? Daniel nodded. Or 3 more pieces of one story? Frank Dalton forced a nervous smile. Old recordings prove nothing. We still have no evidence that anyone inside this company has done anything wrong. Daniel calmly closed the analyzer. Then perhaps we should stop asking who installed the device. Madison looked at him with quiet curiosity. What should we ask instead? Daniel answered. Who has been trying to keep anyone from finding it? The room became silent once again. The chief avionics engineer suddenly looked toward the digital maintenance archive displayed on the conference screen. If someone altered inspection records for 12 years, they would need executive authorization. Frank immediately folded his arms. Hundreds of employees have held administrative access over that time. Daniel gently shook his head. Not to classified research divisions. Madison slowly turned toward the company attorney. Can anyone still access those records? The attorney hesitated before answering. Officially, no. The Advanced Research Division was dissolved after your father's death. Daniel quietly smiled. Officially. Madison noticed the expression. You think it never disappeared? Daniel answered without emotion. I think someone changed its name. Before anyone could respond, the analyzer emitted another soft tone from inside the closed toolbox. Daniel opened it and watched a new message appear automatically on the display. Secondary authentication required. Original calibration key detected. Madison frowned. Calibration key? Daniel looked at the old brass tool resting on the conference table. Walter designed every secure project so that digital files could only be unlocked with a physical engineering key. He believed people could steal passwords, but not character. The chief avionics engineer carefully placed the brass tool beside the analyzer. The display immediately recognized it, and another hidden directory slowly appeared. Frank's face noticeably lost color. That should not be possible, Daniel quietly replied. It was always possible. Very few people knew how. The second encrypted folder did not contain another recording. Instead, it displayed dozens of flight numbers, dates, fuel reports, and maintenance authorizations stretching back more than a decade. Madison scanned the list with growing confusion. These are my father's aircraft movements. Daniel pointed towards several highlighted entries. Look closer. She did. Every highlighted flight had one detail in common. The aircraft had departed with full fuel capacity, but landed with almost exactly the same amount still on board. That cannot be right, she whispered. Those flights traveled hundreds of miles. Daniel nodded. Because they never actually made those trips. The attorney leaned closer. Then why create false flight records? Daniel answered quietly. To make everyone believe the aircraft was somewhere else. Nobody spoke. The realization settled heavily across the room. Someone had been using the company's official aircraft history as an alibi for years. Madison slowly looked toward Frank. Who approved these reports after my father died? Frank immediately answered. I would have to review the records. Daniel calmly reached toward the screen and enlarged one authorization signature. You already have. Beneath every altered report appeared the same digital approval code. F. Dalton. Frank stared at the screen without speaking. His silence lasted just long enough for everyone else to notice. Those signatures could have been forged, he finally said. Daniel did not argue. Perhaps. Then he opened one final attachment connected to the same authorization code. It was not a document. It was a maintenance camera image automatically captured years earlier inside this very hangar. The resolution was poor, but one detail remained unmistakably clear. A man stood beside Madison's aircraft late at night, holding the same distinctive leather briefcase Frank carried to every executive meeting. Frank looked away from the screen for the first time that day. Madison did not raise her voice. She simply asked one question. Why were you here after midnight? Frank offered no answer. Daniel quietly closed the image and looked toward the large windows overlooking the silent aircraft. We are getting closer, he said softly. But Walter Reed did not hide four messages just to expose one executive. He rested his hand on the old toolbox, feeling the worn leather tag beneath his fingers once again. Deep inside, he could not shake the feeling that the final recording would reveal something far more personal than anyone in the room was prepared to hear. Madison Reed remained seated, her eyes fixed on the maintenance image still glowing across the conference room screen. Frank Dalton finally broke the silence. That photograph proves I inspected the aircraft after business hours. Nothing more. Daniel Brooks quietly nodded. You are right. Frank looked relieved for only a moment. Daniel continued. By itself, it proves nothing. He reached for the analyzer once more and gently inserted the brass calibration key. The display immediately unlocked another encrypted section marked Segment 2. A brief burst of static filled the room before Walter Reed's familiar voice returned. If you are hearing this message, then Daniel has already discovered the hidden transmitter. Good. That means he is still paying attention to details that everyone else ignores. Madison lowered her eyes. Daniel remained perfectly still. Walter continued speaking with the same calm confidence that had guided generations of engineers. The transmitter was never my greatest concern. It was bait. I needed the wrong people to protect it because they would unknowingly reveal something much larger. The recording ended as abruptly as it had begun. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Daniel quietly opened the newly unlocked directory. Instead of audio files, dozens of engineering diagrams appeared beside internal approval records, encrypted financial transfers, and maintenance authorizations stretching back nearly 15 years. The chief avionics engineer slowly leaned closer. These diagrams do not belong to Reed Meridian Aerospace anymore. Daniel studied the drawings carefully, because they were never supposed to leave the research division. Madison looked through the files one by one until she noticed several confidential blueprints carrying approval signatures from executives who had retired years earlier. Each blueprint had later appeared inside competing aerospace companies under different project names. Her expression changed from confusion to quiet disappointment. Someone has been stealing our research for years. Daniel gently corrected her. Selling it. The room became silent once again. Frank immediately objected. Those files could have been copied by anyone with administrator privileges. Daniel calmly selected a financial ledger hidden inside the encrypted directory. Several wire transfers appeared, each authorized within hours of classified engineering documents being accessed. Every transfer had been routed through consulting firms that no longer existed. The company attorney frowned as he reviewed the records. These shell companies all share the same mailing address. Madison looked toward him. Who owned them? Before the attorney could answer, Daniel enlarged one final page attached to the financial records. At the bottom sat a scanned signature beside the incorporation documents. Richard Cole. Madison's breathing slowed. Richard had served beside her father for years before becoming one of the company's most trusted senior executives after Walter's death. Frank immediately seized the opportunity. Then Richard is responsible. I told you this has nothing to do with me. Daniel looked toward him with the same quiet patience he had shown all morning. Perhaps. He selected another attachment. This time, it was an executive authorization chain requiring 2 separate approvals before any classified document could leave the research division. Richard Cole had approved every transfer. The second signature appeared beneath each one. Frank Dalton. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody accused anyone. The documents spoke for themselves. Frank slowly lowered his eyes, but Daniel did not look satisfied. Instead, he quietly stared at the analyzer display, where one final notification had appeared beneath the completed files. Segment 3 available. Final authorization required. Madison noticed it immediately. One recording left. Daniel nodded. The last one was never meant to expose stolen technology. He gently rested his hand on the worn leather toolbox that had followed him through every ordinary workday since leaving the aerospace industry. Walter protected these files because they mattered, but he protected the final message because someone mattered. Madison looked at him in silence, remembering the way her father's voice had spoken Daniel's name with complete trust. Outside the conference room window, the polished Gulf Stream remained motionless beneath the bright hangar lights, no longer waiting for permission to fly, but quietly holding the last piece of a truth that had survived 12 years, countless lies, and one man who had never stopped listening when everyone else only looked. Daniel Brooks slowly lifted the brass calibration key and placed it into the final authentication slot on the analyzer. Nobody in the conference room moved. Madison Reed watched the screen with quiet determination while the company attorney and chief avionics engineer stood silently beside her. Even Frank Dalton had stopped searching for excuses. The analyzer emitted one soft tone before displaying a single line of text. Final segment authorized. Walter Reed's voice returned for the last time, steady and unmistakably warm. Madison, if this message has reached you, then the truth has finally survived long enough to find its way home. She closed her eyes as she listened. You will discover that people you trusted betrayed this company. Justice matters, but it is not the most important thing I want you to remember. Character always outlives power. Walter paused for several seconds before continuing. Daniel, I know you will try to return to your quiet life the moment this is over. That has always been your nature. You never wanted recognition. You only wanted people to arrive home safely. Daniel lowered his eyes without speaking. Walter's voice carried a gentle smile that everyone in the room could almost hear. Many years ago, after the accident that destroyed your career, you believed I accepted your resignation. I did not. Madison looked toward Daniel in surprise. Walter continued. I locked your position instead of replacing you because I believed one day you would come back when the company needed your judgment more than your engineering. Silence filled the room again before the final words arrived. Madison, if Daniel is willing, offer him the responsibility of protecting every aircraft that carries our family name. Trust his decisions even when they are unpopular. The safest flight is often the one that never leaves the ground. The recording ended. No. Additional files appeared. No hidden codes remained. Only quiet remained inside the conference room. Madison slowly stood and walked toward Daniel. My father already made his decision years ago, she said softly. The position is yours if you want it. Daniel smiled with the same humility he had carried all morning. I appreciate the honor, but I have a little girl expecting me at her school concert this evening. Madison smiled for the first time that day. Then go be her father. She extended her hand. When you are ready, the door will still be open. Daniel accepted the handshake, not as a man who had won an argument, but as someone who had quietly restored trust. The company attorney informed Madison that federal investigators had already been notified and that the recovered records would begin a formal legal process. Frank Dalton lowered his head without another word as security quietly escorted him from the room. Nobody celebrated his departure. Justice did not need applause. A short time later, Daniel walked across the peaceful hangar carrying the same worn toolbox that everyone had ignored that morning. Outside, the late afternoon sun reflected across the polished fuselage of the grounded aircraft. He paused beside his old pickup truck and reached into the toolbox for his keys. As he lifted the tray, something small slid from a hidden compartment beneath the weathered leather lining. It was an unopened envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with the familiar compass rose and 3 stars. Across the front, written in Walter Reed's unmistakable handwriting, were only 8 words. For Daniel Brooks. Open only after you return. Daniel stared at the envelope in complete silence. He slowly looked back toward the hangar where Madison was still standing beside the aircraft, unaware of what he had found. Then he quietly smiled to himself, because in that single unexpected moment, he realized the greatest secret had never been hidden inside the private jet at all. Walter Reed had hidden it inside the toolbox Daniel had faithfully carried for 12 years, believing that one day the man who walked away from greatness to become a devoted single father would finally come home on his own terms.